Welcome to Fascism on Film. This is a new podcast, and it's brought to you by myself, James Kent, and along with me is, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Oh, hi, I'm Teal Minton. James and I have been co-hosting a podcast called Stuff We've Seen for about 5 years now, and now we're starting this discussion of fascism on film.
It's actually been over 6 years.
Okay.
All right, we're already on the wrong track. No, but yes, as Teal has said, we've had a entertainment podcast. This is going to be a little bit different than that, and a little bit about myself. I am a writer. I am the arts editor for the Mountain Times in Vermont. That's a newspaper.
I am also a writer. I've been a screenwriter, a fiction writer, and I currently teach in the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing program at Lindenwood University. And I've taught creative writing and screenwriting for about 15 years. And I come at a lot of these discussions as a creative person, not as necessarily an analytical. I'm not from the English department. I'm from the art department. So I have that view that I'm bringing with me.
Yeah, and just so you know, if you're never listened to the show before and you're hearing us for the first time, we've just given you more information about ourselves than we've ever given on the other podcast. And I'm not joking.
That's true. Yeah.
We keep things very jovial and a little bit tongue-in-cheek on our other show. And this is a little bit more of a serious topic, which is why we decided to branch this out into its own podcast. And, to say the word that both of us are fascinated with fascism on film sounds a little odd, right? Like you're obsessed with it or something, or fascinated. But I think that in a dramatic form, sometimes comedy, sometimes drama, horror, action, fascism as a topic comes up, and we didn't realize that each of us kind of, I guess as a subgenre, watched a lot of these films to educate ourselves a little bit, being film people. And once we discovered that, we started talking about it a lot.
Yeah, and this ongoing conversation between the two of us, I think it's been about 2 years since we really started watching fascism films and talking about them and writing about them and reading about them. And so we've had this ongoing conversation about it, and now we're basically recording those conversations so we can share some of what we've learned, what we've experienced from these films. And I think for me, it was a few years ago, I remember I went through a series of watching a bunch of horror movies. And afterwards, I thought, I want to watch something that has real life horror in it. And I ended up watching, I think, The Damned. And yeah, great place to start, right? And it's sort of, I think both of us just sort of took this on as a matter of curiosity, really more than anything else, and just wanting to explore this theme. Definitely there are contemporary parallels, not just in the US, but around the world, and sort of looking at those and thinking, what can film teach us about these? Fascism and film have been around about as long as each other. And they've been intertwined through propaganda, through resistance, through examination. So these filmmakers who have experienced these things and studied these things have really something to show us about this topic that is, I believe, meaningful and can, in a way, only be really shown in film. When you read about fascism, there's a lot of abstraction and theory and things like that, but it's very different to watch a film and feel somebody's pain in one of these kinds of situations.
For me, delving into these films prior to Teal and I kind of realizing that maybe we could lend some of our knowledge and expertise to the subject at a different level, I was always searching as a child of the 70s and 80s. I was searching for meaning. You'd hear fascism. That term has been thrown out, around for years. And you find both the right and the left using that phrase to call the other person a fascist. And so through reading and films, I kind of wanted to answer certain questions for myself, because when we think of the events of Nazi Germany and then also fascist Italy and the big culmination of the Holocaust, the question that still gets asked today that people, I think when they first started to try to tackle that subject, is say, well, A, what is fascism? And B, like, how did it happen? How could so many
Yeah,
people fall into this trap? And then why couldn't they just, resist it, etc.? And
right.
you can read books that kind of answer some of those questions, but then we have a wealth of movies where filmmakers try to ask that same question, and they
Mhm,
try to answer it through storytelling. And now it's sort of broken into phases. I'm fascinated with movies that came out in the lead up to World War II. So
mhm.
you have movies that say may have been made in Germany and Italy under the fascist umbrella. And then you also have movies where America, and you can imagine that America, Hollywood in the 30s. Well, first of all, there was a lot of sympathy for Hitler at first in the United States.
Yeah,
And there were, in the studio heads, I mean, the majority at the time were of Jewish descent. They had moved to Hollywood, California, and started the film industry. So, like the Louis B. Mayers, the Warner Brothers,
yeah, the Warner Brothers, who were, sort of the first to really take on this topic.
yeah, and so they were struggling for again, you had the Hays Code, which was like, what you could and couldn't do in films.
Yeah, and one of the things you couldn't do was criticize a foreign government.
Yeah, isn't that weird? But like, this is the kind of stuff that was out there that people may not realize today. So suddenly Hollywood was having a challenge. You had, first of all, a lot of filmmakers and actors and like other people involved in the film industries in Europe were escaping
Yes.
Europe and coming to America, and they got out. Some of it was that Hollywood found ways to connect them to like, oh, we need these people to help make movies, and so a lot of people
Yeah.
came over, and they were doing what they could. But suddenly a lightning tornado that's happening very fast, you sometimes can't move fast enough. And so I'm fascinated with what was Hollywood's response to fascism at
Mhm.
the time. And then, of course, as World War II ramped up, the propaganda machine that happened in order to counter Hitler from a
Yeah.
filmmaking standpoint. Then the post-war response, where this is where you have filmmakers who lived through World War II on the
Yeah.
American side, or
Or on the European side.
yeah, and European filmmakers that lived through the fascism and they might have been even kids
Yeah.
who from the late 40s on through 60s and 70s, now they get their opportunity to comment, make films about the experience.
Yeah, and we did have a real, sort of slew of these films in the '60s and '70s. It was sort of this, yeah, those people who had maybe been children or were baby boomers that sort of grew up into trying to reckon with this part of their history, whether it's American or European. But a lot of the European films are trying to deal with that question of how did this happen to us? How did we fall into this? What's the allure and the attraction of fascism, and not just its dangers and its evils, but what draws people into it?
I think that again, as a kid growing up and watching films and learning, again, how much of film, it's somewhat fantasy, but learning what I could about fascism, some things that would pop into my head would be, I'm so glad that I didn't live through that and that, that should never happen again. It almost seemed absurd that, say, America could fall under authoritarian rule. It just didn't seem possible. Felt like we had the
Yeah.
mechanisms in place. Even though, I'll be honest, now coming from a white person's perspective, I don't think I saw through a lot of fascist aspects of America that people who were not white have experienced
Yes.
in the country. And that's because my, I guess, white privilege, I now see that a little bit differently. And what we've seen happen over the last, I mean, it's a little bit more than 8 years, but let's
Mhm.
just say 8 years. And tools, the device of social media and having a phone at your disposal. I don't think when the smartphone first came about, I could ever have thought at the time that I could, that could be an attributing factor to.
That it becomes like so many other information technologies, a tool of propaganda. And this is exactly what we saw happen with cinema, is it was this new way of reaching the masses, and it was co-opted very heavily by Nazi Germany as a propaganda form because they understood power of myth making that cinema has.
Yeah, the difference is that it was almost like a one-way propaganda, right? So you fed
Yes.
it to people. Today, you have that side feeding propaganda to the masses, but now the masses interacting with each other and spreading it at the speed of light almost in a
At the
way that
speed of
never
light,
happened
yeah.
before.
And that used to happen in word of mouth, or people would get together in a cafe and have these discussions, and there isn't a lot bumping up against it. Once you're in that sort of echo chamber, there isn't a lot coming against it, and fascism in general does create an echo chamber for itself. Where it reaffirms everything everyone believes, and anybody who doesn't believe that is an outsider who needs to be eliminated.
What we're going to be doing with this podcast, and this is sort of our introduction episode, we're going to break things down into little buckets. And, we're trying to keep things at maybe around a half hour length per episode. And we won't answer these questions today, but there'll be questions that either Tia will ask me or I'll ask him. And we'll try to come up with some answers and then tie them to movies. But one question will be kind of an obvious. Do we feel like what's happening today in America is fascism? And is that label appropriate? Or is authoritarianism more like, what, and is there
Right.
like, what are the differences do we feel or similarities? And fascism may be an outdated term because it was very, very specific to Italy and
Yeah.
their approach to government. Then
Mussolini invented the term and the ideology itself, and it is difficult to define. It's filled with internal contradictions, and it opposes itself. For instance, in fascism, your enemy is always incredibly strong and pathetic and weak at the same time. And so these inherent contradictions are part of the ideology itself, and so there are a lot of lies. But in terms of is what we're seeing now fascism? I think, George Orwell 75 years ago said fascism is a pointless term. It's just an epithet. It doesn't have any meaning. But but people actually do believe it has meaning, and there are some definitions of it, and we can go through these definitions and sort of check off boxes and say, well, this matches. Oh, it only got 11 out of 14 boxes. Maybe it's not fascism. And the fact of the matter is that it isn't a really clearly defined thing. There are fascist adjacent or fascist like governments. There are elements of fascism that you can see in certain governments. And so whether it's fascism or authoritarianism, fascism does have this very frequently has this racial component. And you don't necessarily see that in authoritarianism. So I'm just going to throw out, because I'm working from a couple definitions of fascism as we approach this show and look at these movies. But again, I'm not looking at like a checklist of does it fit into the fascism rubric. I'm interested in exploring the ideas that are in fascism, even if they're contradictory or don't make a lot of sense. There's a lot of nonsense coming out of fascism. So here's one definition I'm working from. This is Roger Griffin from The Nature of Fascism. He says, fascism is a genus of political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. That's quite a mouthful, but what he's saying essentially is that the ideology of fascism is about glorious rebirth through crisis. And this is about returning to a mythic, glorious past, ushering us through societal, economic collapse, things like that, and coming out the other side reborn in this glorious, mythic entity of government and nationalism. And so Griffin is arguing that that is the core, that palinogenesis, that rebirth is the core ideology of any fascism, and that everything else sort of comes out from there. He goes, of course, he has a whole book on this, on what the nature of fascism is, but he argues that it's an ideology at the core. Another scholar that I've been reading a lot and really appreciate is Robert Paxton, who wrote a book called The Anatomy of Fascism. And he does call what's happening in the US right now fascism. And he is kind of the world's leading expert on this. So when he says that, and he said that in 2021, so you kind of got to take his word for it a little bit, in my opinion.
You said a mouthful here, and you can pretty quickly sum up what's happened in this country in the last few months, there's been a lot of crises that have been created,
Yes.
financial crises, whether it's like a tariff war that's a question mark as to why. But, I could offer at the end of it, after so much financial loss, if then there's a transformation by ending such the crisis,
Yeah.
and suddenly you see money come back again, especially if you have a pretty good propaganda arm, you can say, look at how great things are now.
Exactly. We have made it great again.
We've made it great again, even though we made it terrible.
Yeah.
And then, again, with any of these things, with government, doesn't matter whether or not removing all of these people from the government hinders economically, because a lot of these jobs
Right.
they create a good economy. The fact is that you don't really have to say whether or not you saved any money. You can just say that you did. And
Yeah.
again, once you've got people this far, it's not that hard to get them to continue believing whatever you tell them.
Well, and when we look at both fascist Italy and fascist Germany, is that they were both coming out of a depression, out of being economically and militarily weak, out of the loss of World War I. And so they were the Weimar Republic was in crisis. And the Nazis promised, we will get you through this crisis and out the other side into a glorious 1,000-year Reich. What's different right now in the U.S. is that we're coming in with a fairly stable economy, the world's largest military, and the world's most powerful bully pulpit. And so it's a very different historical contingency, even though a lot of the underlying themes and ideologies and actions may be similar.
Yeah, and I would also say that I think there's one, I don't know if it's an undeniable fact about fascism, whatever terminology we decide on, whether that's right or not, fitting the United States or any other
Yeah.
country, is that, and I feel like this is important because it's something from an education standpoint, a lot of people clearly still don't understand that fascism, no matter how you define it, is a far right ideology. It is not
Yes.
a left ideology. So when you apply it to what people considered the left, there may be, shades, or at least you can convince somebody that a shade here and there may seem fascist, because that's the fashion to always say, that's fascist. But it's always important to note that fascism comes from extreme conservative right wing thinking, not on the left.
Yeah. And I mean, the Nazis' biggest enemies are communist and socialist. So, they didn't really see eye to eye on that. And fascism in general tends towards capitalism. There is often a mutual beneficial partnership between capital and fascist leadership.
We're not two hippies here going down with capitalism. It's all fascist. But what we've discovered, I think, and this is what we will talk about with these movies, is it was a little bit of an eye opener as we really looked at American history through the lens of films,
Yes.
and found that even before the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy, America, in a lot of the way it behaved and operated, was a blueprint for fascism.
Absolutely. And if you look at the pre-war South and the post-war Jim Crow South, there is a lot of overlap with fascism. And if you look at the Ku Klux Klan, that is actually a proto-fascist organization that served as some inspiration to European fascists.
Yeah, because, white nationalism is about racial purity.
Yes, and that purity movement, that in-group, out-group part of fascism is there, and it's often the out-group is defined racially, or ethnically, or religiously, or politically, or basically anything that's not like you put into the out-group, and the out-group needs to be cleansed. There needs to be part of this palinogenic rebirth is a cleansing of the national soul and removing it of impurities. And that's generally these ethnic or religious groups. I have another quote I'm going to read, if you don't mind.
I don't know about the listener, but I don't.
We can cut it later if we need to. So I mentioned Griffin, who talks about how there's an ideology at the heart of fascism, and Robert Paxton believes that more than ideology, fascism is a behavior or a set of actions, and that it demonstrates itself through action more than ideology. And it's a very interesting point because fascism is obsessed with action. I'm not going to read the entire quote, but I think the part that Robert Paxton has what he calls 5 stages of fascism. And I think these are important for us to look at as we're trying to put these films into different categories. And you had sort of mentioned that earlier with the pre-war versus the post-war films. So Paxton's 5 stages of fascism. First one is intellectual exploration, which is just people starting to write fascist ideas and put them out into the public. Then it becomes rooted. Stage 2 is rooting in political culture, and this is when we start to see movements taking shape and people coming together and making signs and things like that and sort of promoting these. It's important to remember that fascism is not something that's imposed by a draconian government. Fascism is a mass popular enthusiasm that rises from the people coalescing around a charismatic leader, but usually in a democracy. Paxton stage 3 is arrival to power, which is when the fascists basically through election or appointment or whatever actually come to power. Stage 4 is exercise of power. Well, this is when they are in power and start reshaping society. And that's really basically, yeah, after Hitler came to power up until 1939 or so, when we enter stage 5, which is radicalization or entropy. And radicalization is descending into extreme violence. And so that's where we have the death camps and the concentration camps, is that's the radicalization. In decay and collapse, we might have something more like Franco's Spain, where there isn't a war that stops it, but the charismatic leader's death sort of dissolves the fascism. And so all the movies that we're talking about take place in these different stages. Some of them go through all the stages. A movie like The Mortal Storm starts with the intellectual exploration and goes right through to radicalization. And so it's very interesting to think about this for me. And in terms of defining what fascism is, yeah, like we've talked about it, it is a really complicated definition. And I think for us, for this show, we're using a definition with slightly blurry edges. Some of these films, absolutely, no question that Cabaret is about fascism. There may be some debate over Birth of a Nation and whether the KKK is fascist, but for our purposes, we're looking at that as fascism.
You're giving me so much to comment. I mean, looks like what United States is at 4 or 5. So
Yes,
that's great.
we're at 4.
We're
The
at
United
4.
States is at 4.
Yeah, we're
Yep.
at DEFCON 4, and I'm not sure exactly when we'll get to it, but I think one of the fascinating things is we started to peel back the layers and really get deeper into these films. We watched Birth of a Nation. I don't recommend that to be your first stop in the
No, definitely
fascism
not
tour.
the first stop, or maybe any stop. It's not a film I highly recommend to people other than those that are. I mean, you have to be prepared to take on something that is basically a white supremacist, a 3-hour white supremacist propaganda film.
That's the thing is, being a film lover and had gone to film school. My background is where I met Teal at New York University at Tisch Film School. At the time, seen a couple of scenes of Birth of a Nation. They showed it
Yeah,
as example because even back then, it was kind of thrown as that, well, Birth of a Nation's a little outdated and it's obviously racist and there's a couple of really bad racist scenes, but it's also the birth of film editing and all these
yeah.
different directorial techniques.
It invented the close-up.
And, a couple of years ago, this has been an ongoing project and it's now manifested itself into this podcast, but Teal and I have also been working, and it's been on pause for a year, but we've been working on a book version of this as well. And through that, we watched Birth of a Nation, and I watched it a couple of times, and it's so much more beyond what I could have even
Yeah,
imagined in the level
yeah,
of how insidious and awful it is, and to know the history of how popular a movie it really was a huge piece of propaganda that sold the idea of the virtuous white man and its purity and its struggle in the birth of a nation against the black man. That is quite it's a horrific movie, and it is really, to me, it is a blueprint for fascism because of its popularity. It is no doubt something that in Europe they looked at.
Oh, they absolutely did. It led to the resurgence of the Klan in the U.S. It was a very successful piece of fascist propaganda that actually created action based on the film, and that to me is really the first fascist film. And yes, it's a piece of propaganda, but it is to me where fascism on film begins. 1915.
In this first episode, if you're wondering, okay, well, where should I start? I think that I don't know if it's the best starting point. I mean, if you're looking for like the best movie to sort of introduce you to kind of what was happening in Nazi Germany, a movie that we talked about once on the podcast, our Stuff We've Seen show, and we are going to talk about it again, is The Mortal Storm.
Yeah.
And this was America's real first attempt to try to make sense of what was happening over in Nazi Germany. The fascinating aspect of this is that a lot of times people will mistakenly say that America didn't really know what was going on in
Yeah.
Nazi Germany in terms of what was happening to the Jews in concentration camps. And yet this movie was produced. It came out, unfortunately, while it was still in its final stages of production. Germany declared war on Poland, so the war had already broken
Yeah.
out, but it was shot before that, and it makes pretty clear that America knew concentration camps were happening.
Absolutely. Well, and this is a film too that goes through all the 5 stages. And I think that when I say fascism on film to people, their immediate thought that comes to mind is stage 5, which is the radical violence, right? And that's kind of the flashy, most cinematic part of it, and that's what comes to mind is the Holocaust, is SS guys goose stepping, is sort of the visual theatrics of fascism. But there's so much more before that, and The Mortal Storm does show us that rooting in the culture and how it affects people on a personal level and how it tears families apart. And so there is a lot more to the cinematic conversation than just the stage 5 radicalization.
So you can see already, huge topic, lots to discuss, and we're not going to be getting too into movies this episode. But I'm hoping that you'll join us for these episodes because there's going to be a lot of interesting films that we'll cover and really dive deeper into those aspects of fascism. And again, we don't have solutions.
No, and we don't have all the answers. We're here welcoming you into the conversation that we're having, and we hope that you will then take this into conversations in your life, and you can be informed by it and understand what people have been telling us for the last century about the dangers of fascism.
I think the two of us, we've kind of landed on the fact that we feel, whether it's fascism light or fascism at all, that we as a country may be in stage 4.
Yeah.
And how far into stage 4 will we get? And will it manifest itself into stage 5? Well, we hope not. And again, what can we do? That's not really what the purpose of this is to solve that. It's more to educate so you can recognize and make up your own mind of the things that you see when you're exposed to propaganda. Do you realize it? And what have we learned from the movie history? And what does that tell you in those lessons? There's a lot of great films that, just from a historical perspective, if you want to have a better understanding, not every film, I think, has the answer. I think there's still a lot of gaps, but
Yeah.
there are some great films that really help you understand. And there's also, just even understanding what happened in Germany and the conditions that turned it. There's not a ton of films out there, but there are some that are interesting. Sometimes you have to go through some horrific stuff because it's told from the vantage point of Reich cinema. But,
Yes.
there's a lot of perspectives, and we're doing the hard work by watching these films. And
Yeah, because some of these films I definitely don't recommend watching, but they are, I think, vital to the conversation. And, I would also like to say that this show is not a lecture. It's not a textbook. We're not reading a script. We are having a conversation. It's an exploration of these ideas and these issues.
yes, again, we're trying to prepare, but again, we don't know how far we're going to get with each episode. As we wrap up, it's very important, if you found us, however you found us on the internet, that we will be putting all of the episodes up on our site, fascismonfilm.com. So that's the place to go for new episodes, but also you can subscribe on Podbeam, or Apple is going to be on the Apple Podcasts. And so that would be a place that once you subscribe, you'll be able to get every episode, and then you don't even have to go searching for them.
Are you done?
Do I sound done? Yes. Now it's your chance to say whatever you want to say.
Oh, I don't have a thought. I was just going to say, like, welcome to the show, join us, but you basically just said all that.
That I did.
So I don't know that we need another ending other than what you just said.
That's true. Well, because it's not an end, this is the beginning.
Yeah, it's the beginning. So
hopefully for us, it's not the beginning of the end. But
yeah. So I think that might be good.
For people who've just finished listening to this episode, what do you got planned for us on episode 2?
Okay, episode 2 is going to be about Cabaret. We've got coming up The Mortal Storm, Mephisto, Triumph of the Will, the Nazi propaganda film, Birth of a Nation, The Conformist, The Last Metro, Rome, Open City, Sophie Scholl, The Final Days. I could just go on and on. We have a very long list of movies that we're going to be getting into, and all sorts of different. We talked about sort of what it teaches us about fascism, but also these films ask us questions, and they ask us about our own morals and how we resist and do we comply and those sorts of things. And it really is a moral challenge to get into some of these films, and I think that that's going to be really interesting for us to talk about and as movie watchers.
Even science fiction sort of has a deep legacy.
Absolutely.
And we're talking about anything from Starship Troopers to the Star Wars saga.
The Star Wars saga, absolutely.
If we feel like we need to talk about superheroes, comic book films, Marvel, DC, there's a lot of aspects of fascism baked into those. So,
well, we haven't even really touched on yet, but fascist aesthetics is a whole huge thing because so much of fascism is an aesthetic. As Paxton argues, it's a behavior, not an ideology. He would also argue that the theatricality and the aesthetics are part of that behavior.
That's another thing. When you go to the website, fascismonfilm.com, certainly reach out and tell us if there's certain films that you're hoping we cover, or aspects of this topic that you hope we cover. And, rest assured, we probably will be getting to it, but you never know when you're going to tell us about a movie that we have never seen. And that happened on our last podcast that ties in. We saw this film called Mr. Klein, and that was one of our listeners recommended it. And it is an amazing film, and it also touches on fascism.
Yeah, well, more than touches, but and that's a film we'll be talking about in this show.
Okay, well, I'm going to wrap up for now. But again, catch us on the next episode of Fascism on Film. I'm James Kent, and with me is
Teal Minton.
All right, till next time.